Hello and welcome back to our seminar on Shakespeare. Today I want to discuss Richard III. Richard III is one of Shakespeare's history plays, and in order to be able to better understand the play, we first of all have to talk about the historical context of this play. This play is situated during the Wars of the Roses that took place between 1455 and 1485. The Wars of the Roses were a civil war in England that was fought for the throne between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. House basically means family. So it was fought between the House of York and the House of Lancaster that were symbolized by a white rose for York and a red rose for Lancaster. And the wars ended with the defeat of King Richard III from the House of York by Henry Tudor from the House of Lancaster, and this Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, and this is basically the plot and the action of the play that I'm going to discuss today. And Henry VII married Elizabeth, a member of the House of York, and he thereby united both houses and founded the Tudor dynasty, something that will become important later in this video lecture. Okay, I already said Richard III is a history play. So the question now is, what are history plays? There are 10 history plays that Shakespeare wrote, and their historical context is mainly the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses. And these 10 plays are commonly grouped. There are two groups, two tetralogies. Tetralogy basically means a group of 4 plays. Tetra means 4. And they are termed Lancaster tetralogy and York tetralogy, if we generalize a bit, simply because they deal with kings from the 2 respective houses. So the Lancaster tetralogy basically deals with kings from that house, and the York tetralogy deals with kings from the York house. Okay, but I said there are 10 plays. I just referred to 8 of them, so there are 2 further plays that do not really fit into these categories, but altogether we have 10 history plays. This just as a general overview. Okay, what is a history play? Let's talk about the genre. Shakespeare's history plays have a similar structure to the tragedies. Something that we discussed in detail when we talked about, for example, King Lear or Romeo and Juliet. So they also deal with the fall of the mighty, and they might also be based on poor judgment on the part of the characters. But the difference is that Shakespeare's history plays deal with a specific period in English history. That's important. So if we compare that to the tragedies are based on a variety of topics. For example, if we look at Macbeth, it deals with Scottish history. Julius Caesar, another tragedy by Shakespeare, deals with Roman history. Romeo and Juliet, the play that we discussed a few weeks ago, Romeo and Juliet, is situated in Italy, and it does not focus on history at all, but it discusses the topic of love. So again, the history plays might have a similar structure to the tragedies, fall of the mighty or poor judgment, but the important thing is that they discuss a specific period in English history, as I said, the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, whereas the tragedies are based on a variety of topics. Okay, now that we have discussed the historical context and the genre of the history play, let's turn to Richard III. And as usual, before you continue with the video lecture, please try to create an overview of the play's characters and the play's plot by yourself. This, as usual, will improve your understanding of the play. I know this is a complex play. There are many characters, and it might also be difficult to understand the play, the plot, and the character constellation, because many of the characters might have similar names, there might be similar Richards or similar Henrys, so it might be a slight challenge, but try to create an overview yourself and then please continue. Okay, let's look at the characters in the play. First of all, let me explain. I will now show you an overview, and there are a few explanations in order to make it easier for us to understand this. The crown, of course, simply means kings. Bold print means those are protagonists, main characters. Red means the characters are not part of the play. And of course, there are some characters, several characters actually, that are killed by Richard or that have been killed as part of his plots. Okay, let's have a look. We have the basic structure, House of Lancaster versus House of York. In the House of Lancaster, we have the Duchess of York that was married to some Richard, that is, you see red print, so not part of the play, that was married to some Richard, and they had 3 sons, Edward, who is now at the beginning of the play Edward IV, and who is married to Queen Elizabeth, Clarence, that is killed by Richard in the course of the play right at the beginning, or killed as part of his plots, and we have the 3rd son, Richard, who becomes Richard III in the end, and who is called Gloucester at the beginning of the play, and who marries in the course of the play Lady Anne. On the other side, we have Queen Margaret, who is part of the play, one of the protagonists, who was married to Henry VI, that is already dead at the beginning of the play, and we have Henry VII, that is called Richmond in the course of the play, who becomes king in the end, and who is stepson of Stanley, one of the protagonists, another of the protagonists in this play. Okay, then we have a few allies of Richard. Allies basically means friends, supporters, Buckingham, Catesby and Norfolk. And we have a few more members of the House of York, brother and sons of Elizabeth, Rivers, Grey and Dorset. And you see more and more of these characters that I show now have been killed by Richard in the course of the play or even before the play. Another instance is Edward and Richard. Those are sons of Edward IV and Elizabeth, and this is also an instance of the confusion that this play might create if we do not read carefully, because there are many Edwards, many Richards. It might at some point be a bit difficult, so we have to read carefully and several times. Okay, but this is the character overview. As I said, the basic structure is House of Lancaster versus House of York. Before the play starts, Henry VI was king. At the beginning of the play, Edward IV is king. He dies at some point. Richard III becomes king. He's killed in the end, and Henry VII takes over. And this already leads me to the plot of this play. As I already said, the play is set during the Wars of the Roses, so it is part of the York tetralogy, simply because it is dominated by members or kings of the House of York. For most of the time, or for most of the action of the play, Edward and Richard are kings, members of the House of York. Only at the very end of the play, Henry VII takes over. And as I already said, before the start of the play, Richard has killed the former king Henry VI from the House of Lancaster. At the beginning of the play, King Edward IV from the House of York rules, and his brother Richard is plotting to take over the throne. And this is basically the center of the whole play. The whole action revolves around Richard and his plots. At the start of the play, we are told that King Edward IV will die soon. In the course of the play, Richard removes all the characters that are in his way to power, who could become king themselves or that could oppose his ambitions. For example, he kills his brother Clarence, or has him killed. He has Edward's sons killed. Further members of the York family are killed, for example, Elizabeth's son and her brother, and also Buckingham, who was an ally, but who seems to become unreliable. Towards the end of the play, Richard becomes king, but his problem is his ruthlessness. This basically means his cruelty. So his problem is his cruelty, which alienates nearly all the other characters. They all begin to keep the distance, to turn away from him. And many of the characters rally around, that basically means support, so they start to support Richmond, and Richmond defeats Richard at the end of the play and becomes King Henry VII. And with the end of the play, the Wars of the Roses also end, and Henry VII, from the House of Lancaster, will afterwards marry Elizabeth from the House of York and unite the houses of York and Lancaster. Okay, now that we have talked about the character constellation and the plot, let's first of all have a look at the character of Richard. Why? Simply because the play is totally dominated by this character. In the play, the character of Richard, that is, as I already said at the beginning of the play, called Gloucester, the character of Richard is presented as some kind of monster, both in his outer appearance and in his behavior. But, and this is important, we must be careful not to equate. What does that mean? We must not identify this depiction in the play with a historical Richard. So be careful, don't think about history now, don't think about the historical Richard, think about Richard in the play. Because the play exaggerates his viciousness. Viciousness basically means his evilness. The play exaggerates this evilness. Why? The reason is that the play was written during the reign of the Tudors. And I hope you remember the Tudors were part of the House of Lancaster. But Richard was from the House of York. So there is something like a Tudor myth. What does that mean? That's a narration, or simply a tale, a narration of history that depicts the Wars of the Roses as a dark period of English history in which Richard III from the House of York represented all that was evil. Bear in mind, Tudor myth, the perspective of the House of Lancaster. I repeat, the Tudor myth is a tale, a narration of history from the perspective of the House of Lancaster. And in this perspective, the Wars of the Roses was a dark period in which the House of York, Richard III, represented all that was evil. And this dark period, this is how the Tudor myth goes, this dark period was ended by the Tudors from the House of Lancaster, mainly by Henry VII, who established a period of peace and prosperity. This is all part of the Tudor myth. Let me repeat. The Tudor myth is a tale, simply speaking, a tale from the perspective of the House of Lancaster. And it says the Wars of the Roses was a dark period, and the evil was the House of York, mainly Richard III. And then someone basically ended this, saved the situation from the House of Lancaster, namely Henry VII, who established a period of peace and prosperity under the Tudors. So let's bear that in mind. When we talk about Richard, we are not talking about the historical Richard, we are talking about the Richard from this play. And this play was written by Shakespeare during the reign of the Tudors. And they, of course, had a very specific perspective on history, emphasizing that the House of York, and especially Richard III, were all that was evil, and only the Tudors finally established, after the end of the Wars of the Roses, a period where there was peace again and where there was prosperity. Okay, so in the play, as I already said, Richard is depicted as an evil character, as a monstrous character. But the interesting thing is, one could argue that he manages to gain our sympathy. And the question is, how does he achieve this? From the outset, right from the beginning of the play, Richard creates an impression of complicity. He attempts to draw us into his plots and onto his side. Just remember, he has a very long monologue right at the beginning of the play, and he already addresses us. He tells us about his plots, and nevertheless, we already begin to feel some kind of sympathy for him, not least because of his power of speech, with which he repeatedly addresses us, the audience, addresses and seduces the audience. This goes as far as we can finally say that in those scenes in which Richard is not on stage, the play seems rather boring, dull, lifeless. The moment Richard is on stage, everything seems to come to life. Whenever he's not there, it seems to be rather lifeless and dull. Okay, and this is one side of what I would call Richard's acting or role-playing. This is directed towards the audience. There's a second side to it. I will come back to that soon. But first of all, there's one side of his acting or role-playing. This is directed towards the audience. He addresses us with his powerful speech. He addresses and seduces the audience. And he manages, I would say, to gain our sympathy, even though we see what he's actually doing all the time. He's basically a criminal. But nevertheless, the way he addresses us, the way he draws us into everything, the way he draws us onto his side, basically by his power of speech, makes us sympathize for him, makes us feel to be part of his plots in some way. And this, I would say, is one side, one part, one aspect of his acting or role-playing. As I said, this is directed towards the audience. We see what he's doing, but he acts and speaks in a way that we are fascinated by him. One could also say that Richard tries to manipulate us and the audience by making use of his outer appearance. Right at the beginning, he himself mentions that he's deformed. And if you look at that picture, this is taken from one of the stagings of the play. If you look at that, and if he refers to it at the beginning of the play, this, I think, could be interpreted as an attempt to manipulate us, the reader, the audience, and to gain our sympathy. And even in the end, we might sympathize with him and his fate when he seems to be completely on his own. We have witnessed all that he did, all his plots, all the people that have been killed. And nevertheless, in the end, we might still feel sympathy for him. Just think about his last, or in the last scenes, think about his famous words, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Very famous words, and I would say they symbolize his loneliness and desperation. And in this situation, I think the audience might still be tempted to sympathize with his character. But let's come back to his role-playing, to his acting. And there's another side to this role-playing. And this, I would say, we see on the level of the plot and the characters. His strategy throughout the play is to perform and to pretend to be, for example, a good brother, a good uncle, or a deeply religious person, or also a desperate lover. So throughout the play, and we as audience see this, he performs, he pretends. He pretends to be someone else, as I said, a good brother. And afterwards he just has his brother killed. Or a desperate lover. Then he marries Lady Anne, and then he just has her killed as well. So he pretends. As I already mentioned, he manages to seduce Lady Anne into marrying him. Just imagine. She knows that he previously killed her former husband, and he nevertheless is able to seduce her into marrying him. Or another example is his pretense, that basically means his acting of refusing the crown. So he pretends to the citizens of London that he's not interested in becoming king, that he actually is a deeply religious person that just wants to stay out of all of this, and he basically turns the table onto the citizens that in the end have to beg him to become king, and then he pretends that only then he will give in and be convinced. And with this side of his role-playing, Richard is able to ascend the throne, that means to become king, but it also contributes to much of the disorder that we see in this play. So let's summarize his acting or role-playing. There are two sides to it. One side directed towards the audience, and with this, I would argue, he manages to gain our sympathy. And there's a second side to it on the level of the characters, and this enables him, via his acting and his plots, to become king. But with his acting, with his role-playing, with all this plotting, he also creates much of the disorder that we see in the play. So let's talk about order and disorder, because this is an essential topic in this play. If we look at the play, we see that Richard represents the opposite of order, and this in several ways. He is presented by this play not only as physically deformed, but also as morally deformed. It seems as if he does not have any moral values. It seems as if he's prepared to do whatever it takes to achieve his goals. And his plots destabilize the already fragile means weak, so his plots destabilize the already weak order that exists in the political and social system of the play. I hope you remember, at the beginning of Act 2, Edward IV tries to secure order by reconciling the opposing parties, the conflicting parties and characters in the play. He tries to secure order by reconciling them, making sure that after his death there will not be another war. And what does Richard do? He destabilizes all that via his plots, by plotting all the time. And he removes and kills everyone that is in his way. By doing this, he creates new tensions and hostilities. So Altogether, Richard is presented as the opposite to a well-ordered social and political structure. And this, of course, in line with the Tudor myth, as I already explained, Richard, the personification of evil, according to this myth. So he represents all that is opposed to a well-ordered social and political structure. And in this context, and also in the context of the Elizabethan world picture, Richard III, who is the disturber of order, the disturber of peace, cannot be considered to be the rightful king. I hope you remember the Elizabethan world picture. We talked about that at the beginning of the semester. And we said that this world picture represents the obsession with a strict, hierarchical, and well-structured order of the Elizabethan age. And of course, also the fear of disorder, the fear of the disruption of order. Let me repeat. Richard III cannot be considered to be the lawful, the rightful king in the context of the Tudor myth, where he is the personification of everything that is evil, and he cannot be the rightful king in the context of the Elizabethan world picture that represents the need for a strict order, for a well-ordered society, and that also represents the fear of disorder. And bear in mind that Richard III was written in that period, during the Elizabethan age. And at this point, we can now see that the topic of the play, order versus disorder, and the structure of the play are closely connected. Let's have a look at that. Towards the end of the play, Richard's antagonist Richmond is introduced. And Richmond represents the positive side of the Tudor myth, mainly harmony or stability or order. So, what has become clear so far is that the structure of the play is based on the opposition York versus Lancaster. So this is the very basic structure of the play. And I have just talked about the topic of the play, order versus disorder. And I have said that both are closely connected. So let's have a look how this works. Towards the end of the play, we see that the opposition, York versus Lancaster, manifests itself in the opposition Richard versus Richmond. And this character constellation, Richard versus Richmond, which represents the structure of the play, mirrors the issue, the content of the play, disorder versus order. So try to understand what I'm referring to at the moment. Let me repeat. We have the basic structure of the play. And this basic structure is Lancaster versus York. And this is personified at some point in the opposition Richard versus Richmond. Richard representing York, Richmond representing Lancaster. And those two characters also represent the opposite sides, order, disorder. Richmond, Lancaster represents order, Richard, York represents disorder. And in this context, we can see that structure and content are closely connected. And this issue is solved in line with the Tudor myth. Richard, the disturber of order, is killed, and Richmond becomes the rightful king and establishes a new and stable order, the Tudor dynasty. This is basically what you see here. We have the two roses that are opposed, basically the structure of the play, Lancaster versus York, Richmond versus Richard, which is closely connected to the content, disorder versus order, and this in the end is united in the Tudor rose, where basically both Roses, Lancaster and York merge, and this happens due to the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and this, of course, is all in line, as I already said, with the Tudor myth. And by this marriage, by ending the Wars of the Roses, as I already said, in the end, the Tudor dynasty is established. Okay, let me just summarize. I said content and structure are in harmony in this play. The content is disorder versus order, and this manifests itself in the structure of the play. Disorder is represented by York, personified by Richard. Order is personified by Richmond from the House of Lancaster. And this is how we see that structure and content in this play are closely related to each other. Okay, but now I've been talking about order and disorder, and there are a few characters, as a group of characters that suffers considerably from the disorder created by Richard, and this group consists of the female characters. This we can see when they lament, basically that means to weep, when they lament the death of their husbands or brothers or children. But the question is lamenting, so weeping, all that these characters can do? So are they restricted to the traditional and passive female gender role, where they cannot do anything and just observe, suffer and weep, or is there more to it? And in the next few minutes, in the next few slides of this video lecture, I will present two different interpretations of the role of women in Richard III, and as usual, in the end, I will leave it to you to decide which of these two interpretations is more convincing to you. So again, I will just present two interpretations, present a few arguments for these interpretations. I will also present you what I think is more convincing to me, but you don't have to follow me. Think about it yourself and find your own position. Again, so the question is, are these women restricted to the traditional, patriarchal, passive female gender role, or is there more to it? Let's have a look. The first interpretation says the female characters in the play can only passively lament and curse. For example, in Act 1, Scene 3, Queen Margaret curses and she prophesies, I hope you remember this, things that actually become true in the course of the play. Or in Act 2, Scene 2 and Act 4, Scene 4, we have three female characters, the Duchess of York, Queen Margaret and Queen Elizabeth, that are presented as women that lament the loss of those that were killed. And these scenes, these instances could be used as an argument for the thesis that the female characters in the play can only passively lament and curse and basically only observe, suffer. So the female characters, this is part of this interpretation, the female characters cannot actively and significantly influence the action and the outcome of the play. They need male support, man, in order to restore the social and political order. Their only contribution, if they contribute anything, their only contribution is to provide some moral authority and justification to the male savior Richmond. So the man that has to save everything and to restore order. And what do I mean by moral authority and justification? They constantly lament, they constantly complain, they constantly blame Richard, and they blame as wives or mothers. And this gives them a very strong moral impetus, a very strong moral position. No one can really refute this if they say Richard is to be blamed for having killed my children. And so in the context of this first interpretation, this interpretation says that the women only suffer, lament, and by doing so provide some moral authority and justification for the main male savior, Richmond. Okay, but let's look at the second interpretation. The second interpretation goes as follows. The female characters do not correspond to the patriarchal ideal of the passive, suffering, and self-abandoning good woman. What does that mean, self-abandoning? That means that they do not pay attention to their own interests, they disregard their own interests. So let me repeat. The second interpretation says, no, the women are not in line with traditional images of women. They do not correspond to the patriarchal idea of women. Women that are passive, that are only suffering, that are not paying attention to their own interests, that are basically good women, moral women, passive, self-abandoning, self-sacrificing women. This is the ideal of patriarchy, and the second interpretation says the women in Richard III are not like that. Let's have a look at the arguments. We could say that Queen Margaret's curses that are already referred to, these curses point to the fact that the female characters might not easily fit into patriarchal concepts of the good and moral woman. Because the image of the cursing queen tends to create the patriarchal image of the witch in the play, because curses or spells and prophecies are traditionally associated with witches. Yeah, so I referred to Queen Margaret's curses, and if we have a look at that, the first interpretation would say, yeah, that's all that she can do, so that's basically nothing, no active role, she cannot influence anything. But in the context of the second interpretation, this could suddenly be used as an argument to say, yes, but it at least shows us that she does not correspond to the traditional patriarchal idea of the good and moral woman. Okay, let's continue with this second interpretation. These curses seem to turn Queen Margaret into something like a prophetic stage director. A stage director is basically someone who directs a play like a director of a film, for example. Okay, so the curses, and this is another argument in the context of this second interpretation, the curses seem to turn Queen Margaret into the image of a prophetic stage director. And this implies an active and a central role in the play. It seems as if she somehow prophetically stages much of the action. Suddenly, this at least is an argument of the second interpretation, suddenly she seems to be far more important for the action and the outcome of the play than it seemed to be at the beginning. And what is more, and this is another argument for the second interpretation, the female characters transcend, which means go beyond, transcend or go beyond the traditional role of the self-abandoning woman, so the woman that does not pay attention to her own interests and only looks after husband or children. So they transcend, they go beyond this traditional role of the self-abandoning woman that only exists for the good of her husband and her family. On the contrary, these characters make use of the traditional role of the female mourner, so this is someone who is grieving, weeping. So they make use of this traditional role of the female mourner in order to emphasize their own interests and their own claims for superior positions. This is again in Act 2, Scene 2 and Act 4, Scene 4. Let me rephrase that. What are they actually doing? They are referring to their losses. Yes, They are referring to family members of high social rank. This is important. They are referring to family members they lost. But the important thing is they are referring to family members of high social rank. By doing so, these three female characters implicitly also refer to their former social status. Let me try to repeat this. What is the argument here? The argument is basically, or the interpretation, let's say, the thesis is that these female characters do not correspond to the traditional image of the self-abandoning woman of patriarchy. And what is this last argument? The argument is that these three characters make use of this traditional role of suffering, complaining, mourning, in order to emphasize their own interests. And how do they do this? They refer to family members they lost. But interestingly, these family members are all of high social rank. And by doing so, they implicitly also refer to their own positions that they lost and they implicitly want to have back. If you look at the two scenes that I mentioned, if you look at them and have a closer look at them, you will see that much of their complaining, much of their lamenting is about social positions they lost, or implicitly about this, and also implicitly about wanting to be back in these positions. Okay, let's conclude and let's compare. I would say, first of all, both interpretations present good arguments. But I would say that the female characters stay within the limits of traditional and patriarchal images of women. So I tend to support the first interpretation. Why? First of all, okay, the play might present one of the female characters like some kind of witch, okay, but this is already part of traditional images of women, of patriarchal images of women, because these images are binary. Binary means there are two opposing ones. So these images already are binary. There are already two of them. Black and white, good and bad. And this is what we have here. Good woman versus bad woman. Either the woman is good, which means pure and moral. If she is not so, she immediately turns into a bad woman. And this is also part of the patriarchal idea of women. And the witch, the concept of the witch, can easily be situated in the context of this image of bad woman. Okay, and secondly, there's another argument that I would say supports the first interpretation. The women remain passive. I don't think there is much to be debated. When we have a look at the play, in the end, more or less, they remain passive. Nothing comes of their lamenting. They do not really and significantly influence the events. The argument that Queen Margaret is some kind of stage director, this argument does not really convince me, because there might be several reasons why it's not so convincing. I think one of the most important ones is that the characters' fates are predetermined. This is what stage director means. But when we have a look at the play, we see that the events and outcomes depend on the characters' decisions. If they had decided differently, the outcomes would have been different. So the fates are not predetermined. Think about our discussion of tragedies. I would say, in this instance, the history play Richard III is very similar to the tragedies that we've discussed, for example, King Lear or Romeo and Juliet. Similar to these tragedies, because in the end, it is not about the concept of fate, it is about poor judgment, as one of the characters in King Lear states. Poor judgment, as simple as that. Okay, so this is my interpretation, and as I said, I support the first interpretation, but again, I leave this to you. Decide think about it, come to a good position, and I don't want to convince you, I just present some arguments. Okay, this is now the end. Thanks for watching. This was the last video in this seminar. I hope you have enjoyed watching my videos, and I think I will be back next semester with new videos. Goodbye.